back to another Aristogenesis reading. This time we're reading Book 1 of Aristotle's work, The Politics. And Aristotle is the philosopher who, I would argue, helped to shape Western civilization better than any other, by teaching and guiding the greatest of his pupils, one Alexander the Great. Without Alexander, Greece may well have fallen to the Persians, and Europe today would look very different. And, without its tutor, Alexander might never have fought and ruled in the manner that he did. Aristotle says many things that are controversial to the modern ear, but rather than argue against him, the academic community of so-called philosophers have instead decided to remove him from their required reading, as modern men and women who think themselves philosophers grind their teeth into dust in frustration, unable to present any reasonable, logic-based arguments against what he says in his works, only able to appeal to emotion in that typical modern fashion. It's worth saying beforehand, however, that the opinions expressed within this work do not necessarily reflect those of Aristogenesis, but this is one of the greatest works of one of the greatest minds Europe has ever produced. With all that said, let's begin. Chapter 1. The State as an Association. Observation tells us that every state is an association, and that every association is formed with a view to some good purpose. I say good because in all their actions all men do in fact aim at what they think good. Clearly then, as all associations aim at some good, that association which is the most sovereign among them, and embraces all others, will aim highest, i.e., at the most sovereign of all goods. This is the association which we call the state, the association which is political. It is an error to suppose, as some do, that the roles of a statesman, of a king, of a household manager, and of a master of slaves are the same, on the ground that they differ not in kind but only in point of numbers of persons, that a master of slaves, for example, has to do with a few people, a household manager with more, and a statesman or king with more still, as if there were no differences between a large household and a small state. They also reckon that when one person is in personal control over the rest, he has the role of a king, whereas when he takes his turn at ruling and being ruled according to the principles of the science concerned, he is a statesman. But these assertions are false. This will be quite evident if we examine the matter according to our established method. We have to analyse other composite things till they can be subdivided no further, because we have reached the smallest parts of the wholes. So let us in the same way examine the component parts of the state, and we shall see better how these two differ from each other, and whether we can acquire any systematic knowledge about the several roles mentioned. We shall, I think, in this as well as in other subjects, get the best view of the matter if we look at the natural growth of things from the beginning. The first point is that those which are incapable of existing without each other must be united as a pair. For example, the union of male and female is essential for reproduction, and this is not a matter of choice, but is due to the natural urge, which exists in the other animals too, and in plants to propagate one's own kind. Equally essential is the combination of the natural ruler and ruled, for the purpose of preservation. For the element that can use its intelligence to look ahead is by nature ruler and by nature master, while that which has the bodily strength to do the actual work is by nature a slave, one of those who are ruled. Thus there is a common interest uniting master and slave. Nature, then, has distinguished between female and slave. She recognizes different functions and lavishly provides different tools, not an all-purpose tool like the Delphic knife, for every instrument will be made best if it serves not many purposes, but one. But non-Greeks assign to female and slave exactly the same status. This is because they have nothing which is by nature fitted to rule. Their association consists of a male slave and a female slave. So, as the poets say, it is proper that Greeks should rule non-Greeks. The implication being that non-Greek and slave are by nature identical. Thus it was out of the association formed by men with these two, women and slaves, that a household was first formed, and the poet Hesiod was right when he wrote, "Get first a house and a wife and an ox to draw the plough." The ox is the poor man's slave. This association of persons, established according to nature for the satisfaction of daily needs, is the household, the members of which Charondas calls breadfellows, and Epimenides the Cretan stable companions. The next stage is the village, the first association of a number of houses for the satisfaction of something more than daily needs. It comes into being through the processes of nature in the fullest sense, as offshoots of a household are set up by sons and grandsons. The members of such a village are therefore called by some homogalactic. This is why states were at first ruled by kings, as are foreign nations to this day, where they were formed from constituents which were themselves under kingly rule. For every household is ruled by its senior member, as by a king, and the offshoots too, because of their blood relationship, are ruled in the same way. This kind of rule is mentioned in Homer. Each man has power of law over children and wives. He is referring to scattered settlements, which were common in primitive times. For this reason the gods too are said to be governed by a king, namely because men themselves were originally ruled by kings and some are so still. Just as men imagine gods in human shape, so they imagine their way of life to be like that of men. The final association, formed of several villages, is the state. For all practical purposes, the process is now complete. Self-sufficiency has been reached, and while the state came about as a means of securing life itself, it continues in being to secure the good life. Therefore, every state exists by nature, as the earlier associations too were natural. This association is the end of those others, and nature is itself an end, for whatever is the end product of the coming into existence of any object, that is what we call its nature. Of a man, for instance, or a horse, or a household. Moreover, the aim and the end is perfection, and self-sufficiency is both end and perfection. It follows that the state belongs to the class of objects which exist by nature, and that man is by nature a political animal. Anyone who, by his nature, and not simply by ill luck, has no state, is either too bad or too good, either subhuman or superhuman. He is like the war-mad man, condemned in Homer's words as having no family, no law, no home. For he who is such, by nature, is mad on war. He is a non-cooperator, like an isolated piece in a game of drafts. But obviously, man is a political animal in a sense in which a bee is not, or any other gregarious animal. Nature, as we say, does nothing without some purpose, and she has endowed man alone among the animals with the power of speech. Speech is something different from voice, which is possessed by other animals also, and used by them to express pain or pleasure. For their nature does indeed enable them not only to feel pleasure and pain, but to communicate these feelings to each other. Speech, on the other hand, serves to indicate what is useful and what is harmful, and also what is just and what is unjust. but the real difference between man and other animals is that humans alone have perception of good and evil, just and unjust, etc. It is the sharing of a common view in these matters that makes a household and a state. Furthermore, the state has a natural priority over the household, and over any individual among us. For the whole must be prior to the part, separate hand or foot from the whole body, and they will no longer be hand or foot, except in name, as one might speak of a hand or foot sculptured in stone. That will be the condition of the spoiled hand, which no longer has the capacity and the function which define it. So, though we may say they have the same names, we cannot say that they are, in that condition, the same things. It is clear then that the state is both natural and prior to the individual. For if an individual is not fully self-sufficient after separation, he will stand in the same relationship to the whole as the parts in the other case do. Whatever is incapable of participating in the association which we call the state, a dumb animal, for example, and equally whatever is perfectly self-sufficient and has no need to, for example a god, is not a part of the state at all. Among all men, there is a natural impulse towards this kind of association, and the first man to construct a state deserves credit for conferring very great benefits. For as man is the best of all animals when he has reached his full development, so he is worst of all when divorced from law and justice. Injustice armed is hardest to deal with, and though man is born with weapons which he can use in the service of practical wisdom and virtue, it is all too easy for him to use them for the opposite purposes. Hence man without virtue is the most savage, the most unrighteous, and the worst in regard to sexual license and gluttony. The virtue of justice is a feature of a state, for justice is the arrangement of the political association, and a sense of justice decides what is just. Now that I have explained what the component parts of a state are, and since every state consists of households, it is essential to begin with household management. This topic can be subdivided so as to correspond to the parts of which a complete household is made up, namely the free and the slaves, but our method requires us to examine everything when it has been reduced to its smallest parts, and the first and smallest division of a household into parts gives 3 pairs: master and slave, husband and wife, father and children. And so we must ask ourselves what each one of these 3 relationships is, and what sort of thing it ought to be. The word mastership is used to describe the first, and we may use matrimonial, in the case of the union of man and woman, and paternal to describe the other 2, as there is no more specific term for either. We may accept these 3, but we find that there is a 4th element, which some people regard as covering the whole of household management, others as its most important part, and our task is to consider its position. I refer to what is called the acquisition of wealth. First, let us discuss master and slave, in order to see, first of all, how they bear on the provision of essential services, and second of all, whether we can find a better way towards understanding this topic than if we started from the suppositions usually made. For example, some people suppose that being a master requires a certain kind of knowledge, and that this is the same knowledge as is required to manage a household or to be a statesman or a king, an error which we discussed at the beginning. Others say that it is contrary to nature to rule as master over slave, because the distinction between slave and free is one of convention only, and in nature there is no difference, so that this form of rule is based on force and is therefore not just. Now, property is part of a household, and the acquisition of property part of household management. For neither life itself nor the good life is possible without a certain minimum supply of the necessities. Again, in any special skill, the availability of the proper tools will be essential for the performance of this task, and the household manager must have his likewise. Tools may be animate as well as inanimate. For instance, a ship's captain uses a lifeless rudder, but a living man for watch. For a servant is, from the point of view of his craft, categorized as one of its tools. So any piece of property can be regarded as a tool enabling a man to live, and his property is an assemblage of such tools. A slave is a sort of living piece of property, and, like any other servant, is a tool in charge of other tools. For suppose that every tool we had could perform its task, either at our bidding or itself perceiving the need, and if, like the statues made by Daedalus, or the tripods of Hephaestus, of which the poet says that self-moved they enter the assembly of the gods, shuttles in a loom could fly to and fro, and a plucker play a lyre of their own accord, then master craftsmen would have no need of servants, nor masters of slaves. Tools, in the ordinary sense, are productive tools, whereas a piece of property is meant for action. I mean, for example, a shuttle produces something other than its own use. A bed or a garment does not. Moreover, since production and action differ in kind and both require tools, the difference between their tools, too, must be of the same kind. Now, life is action and not production. Therefore, the slave, a servant, is one of the tools that minister to action. A piece of property is spoken of in the same way as a part is, for a part is not only part of something, but belongs to it, and so too does a piece of property. So a slave is not only his master's slave, but belongs to him, while the master is his slave's master, but does not belong to him. These considerations will have shown what the nature and functions of the slave are. Any human being that by nature belongs not to himself, but to another, is by nature a slave, and a human being belongs to another whenever, in spite of being a man, he is a piece of property, i.e., a tool having a separate existence, and meant for action. But whether anyone does in fact by nature answer to this description, and whether or not it is a just and a better thing for one man to be a slave to another, or whether all slavery is contrary to nature, these are the questions which must be considered next. Neither theoretical discussion nor empirical observation presents any difficulty. That one should command and another obey is both necessary and expedient. Indeed, some things are so divided right from birth, some to rule, some to be ruled. There are many different forms of this ruler-ruled relationship, and the quality of the rule depends primarily on the quality of the subjects, rule over man being better than rule over animals, for that which is produced by better men is a better piece of work, and the ruler-ruled relationship is itself a product created by the men involved in it. For wherever there is a combination of elements, continuous or discontinuous, and a common unity is the result, in all such cases the ruler-ruled relationship appears. It appears notably in living creatures as a consequence of their whole nature, and it can exist also where there is no life, as dominance in a musical scale, but that is hardly relevant here. The living creature consists in the first place of mind and body, and of these the former is ruler by nature, the latter ruled. Now, we must always look for nature's own norm in things whose condition is according to nature, and not base our observations on degenerate forms. We must therefore, in this connection, consider the man who is in good condition, mentally and physically, one in whom the rule of mind over body is conspicuous, because the bad and unnatural condition of a permanently or temporarily depraved person will often give the impression that his body is ruling over his soul. However that may be, it is, as I say, within living creatures that we first find it possible to see both the rule of a master and that of a statesman. The rule of soul over body is like a master's rule, while the rule of intelligence over desire is like a statesman's or a king's. In these relationships it is clear that it is both natural and expedient for the body to be ruled by the soul, and for the emotional part of our natures to be ruled by the mind, the part which possesses reason. The reverse, or even parity, would be fatal all round. This is also true as between man and the other animals, for tame animals are by nature better than wild, and it is better for them all to be ruled by men, because it secures their safety. Again, as between male and female, the former is by nature superior and ruler, the latter inferior and subject. And this must hold good of mankind in general. Therefore, whenever there is the same wide discrepancy between human beings as there is between soul and body, or between man and beast, then those whose condition is such that their function is the use of their bodies and nothing better can be expected of them, those, I say, are slaves by nature. It is better for them, just as in the cases mentioned, to be ruled thus. For the slave by nature is he that can and therefore does belong to another, and he that participates in reason so far as to recognize it, but not so as to possess it, whereas the other animals obey not reason but emotions. The use made of slaves hardly differs at all from that of tame animals. They both need help with their bodies to supply our essential needs. It is, then, nature's purpose to make the bodies of free men to differ from those of slaves, the latter strong enough to be used for necessary tasks, the former erect and useless for that kind of work, but well suited for the life of a citizen, of a state, a life which is in turn divided between the requirements of war and peace. But the opposite often occurs. People who have the right kind of bodily physique for free men, but not the soul. Others who have the right soul, but not the body. This much is clear. Suppose that there were men whose mere bodily physique showed the same superiority as is shown by the statues of the gods, then all would agree that the rest of mankind would deserve to be their slaves. And if this is true, in relation to physical superiority, the distinction would be even more justly made in respect of superiority of soul. But it is much more difficult to see beauty of soul than it is to see beauty of body. It is clear, then, that by nature some are free, others slaves, and that for these it is both just and expedient that they should serve as slaves. On the other hand, it is not hard to see that those who take opposing views are also right up to a point. The expressions state of slavery and slave have a double connotation. There exists also a legal slave and state of slavery. The law in question is a kind of agreement, which provides that all that is conquered in war is termed the property of the conquerors. Against this right, many of those versed in law bring a charge analogous to that of illegality, brought against an orator. They hold it to be indefensible that a man who has been overpowered by the violence and superior might of another should become his property. Others see no harm in this, and both views are held by experts. The reason for this difference of opinion, and for the overlap in the arguments used, lies in the fact that, in a way, it is virtue, when it acquires resources, that is best able actually to use force, and in the fact that anything which conquers does so because it excels in some good. It seems, therefore, that force is not without virtue, and that the only dispute is about what is just. Consequently, some think that just, in this connotation, is a nonsense. Others that it means precisely this, that the stronger shall rule. But when these propositions are disentangled, the other arguments have no validity or power to show that the superior in virtue ought not to rule and be master. Some take a firm stand, as they conceive it, on justice in the sense of law, and claim that enslavement in war is just, simply as being legal. But they simultaneously deny it, since it is quite possible that undertaking the war may have been unjust in the first place. Also, one cannot use the term slave properly of one who is undeserving of being a slave. Otherwise we should find among slaves and descendants of slaves even men who seem to be of the noblest birth, should any of them be captured and sold. For this reason they will not apply the term slave to such people, but use it only for non-Greeks. But, in so doing, they are really seeking to define the slave by nature, which was our starting point, for one has to admit that there are some who are slaves everywhere, others who are slaves nowhere. And the same is true of noble birth. Nobles regard themselves as of noble birth not only among their own people, but everywhere, and they allow nobility of birth of non-Greeks to be valid only in non-Greek lands. This involves making two grades of free status and noble birth, one absolute, the other conditional. In a play by Theodectes, Helen is made to say, "Who would think it proper to call me a slave, I who am sprung of divine lineage on both sides?" But in introducing this point, they are really basing the distinction between slave and free, noble-born and base-born, upon virtue and vice. For they maintain that as man is born of man, and beast of beast, so good is born of good. But frequently, though this may be nature's intention, she is unable to realize it. It is clear, then, that there is justification for the difference of opinion. While it is not invariably true that slaves are slaves by nature and others free, yet this distinction does in some cases actually prevail, cases where it is expedient for one to be the master, the other to be the slave. Whereas the one must be ruled, the other should exercise the rule for which he is fitted by nature, thus being the master. For, if the work of being a master is badly done, that is contrary to the interest of both parties, for the part and the whole, the soul and the body, have identical interests. And the slave is, in a sense, a part of his master, a living but separate part of his body. For this reason there is an interest in common and a feeling of friendship between master and slave, wherever they are by nature fitted for this relationship, but not when the relationship arises out of the use of force and by the law which we have been discussing. From all this, it is clear that there is a difference between the rule of master over slave and the rule of a statesman. All forms of rule are not the same, though some say that they are. Rule over naturally free men is different from rule over natural slaves. Rule in a household is monarchical, since every house has one ruler. The rule of a statesman is rule over free and equal persons. A man is not called master in virtue of what he knows, but simply in virtue of the kind of person he is. Similarly with slave and free. Still, there could be such a thing as a master's knowledge or a slave's knowledge. The latter kind may be illustrated by the lessons given by a certain man in Syracuse, who, for a fee, trained houseboys in their ordinary duties, and this kind of instruction might well be extended to include cookery and other forms of domestic service. For the tasks of the slaves differ, some being more essential, some more highly valued, as the proverb has it, slave before slave, master before master. All such fields of knowledge are the business of slaves, whereas a master's knowledge consists in knowing how to put his slaves to use, for it is not in his acquiring of slaves, but in his use of them, that he is master. But the use of slaves is not a form of knowledge that has any great importance or dignity, since it consists in knowing how to direct slaves to do the task which they ought to know how to do. Hence those masters whose means are sufficient to exempt them from the bother employ an overseer to take on this duty, while they devote themselves to statecraft or philosophy. The knowledge of how to acquire slaves is different from both of these, the just method of acquisition, for instance, being a kind of military or hunting skill. So much may suffice to define master and slave. Let us then, since the slave has proved to be part of property, go on to consider property and the acquisition of goods in general, still following our usual method. The first question to be asked might be this: is the acquisition of goods the same as household management, or a part of it, or subsidiary to it? And if it is subsidiary, is it so in the same way as shuttle making is subsidiary to weaving, or as bronze founding is to the making of statues? For these two are not subsidiary in the same way. One provides instruments, the other the material, that is, the substance out of which a product is made, as wool for the weaver, bronze for the sculptor. Now, it is obvious that household management is not the same as the acquisition of goods, because it is the task of the one to provide, the other to use. For what other activity than managing the house is going to make use of what is in the house? But whether acquisition of wealth is part of household management, or a different kind of activity altogether, that is a debatable question. If, that is to say, it is the acquirer's task to see from what sources goods and property may be derived. For there are many varieties of property and riches, so that a first question might be whether farming, and in general the provision and superintendence of the food supply, are parts of the acquisition of goods, or whether they are a different kind of thing. But again, there are many different kinds of food, and that means many different ways of life, both of humans and animals. For as there is no life without food, differences of food produce among animals different kinds of life. Some animals live in herds and others scattered about, whichever helps them to find food. Some of them being carnivorous, some frugivorous, others eating anything. So, in order to make it easier for them to get these nutriments, nature has given them different ways of life. Again, since animals do not all like the same food but have different tastes according to their nature, so the ways of living of carnivorous and frugivorous animals themselves differ according to their different kinds. Similarly, among human beings there are many varieties of life. First, there are the nomads, who do least work, for nutriment from a domestic animal is obtained with a minimum of toil and a maximum of ease, but when the animals have to move to fresh pastures, the human beings have to go with them, tilling as it were a living soil. Others live from hunting in all its variety, some being simply raiders, others fishermen who live near a lake, a marsh, a river, or a fish-bearing area of the sea. Others live off birds and wild animals. The third and largest class lives off the earth and its cultivated crops. These then are the main ways of living by natural productive labour, ways that do not depend for a food supply on exchange or trade. They are the nomadic, the agricultural, the piratical, fishing and hunting. Some men live happily enough by combining them, making up for the deficiencies of one by adding a second, at the point where the other fails to be self-sufficient. Such combinations are nomadism with piracy, agriculture with hunting, and so on. They simply live the life that their needs compel them to. Such a mode of acquisition is clearly given by nature herself to all her creatures, both at the time of their birth and when they are fully grown. For some animals produce at the very beginning of procreation sufficient food to last their offspring until such time as these are able to get it for themselves. For example, those which produce their young as grubs or eggs. Those which produce live offspring carry in themselves sufficient food for some time, the natural substance which we call milk. So obviously, by parity of reasoning, we must believe that animals are provided for at a larger stage too, that plants exist for their sake, and that the other animals exist for the sake of man, tame ones for the use he can make of them, as well as for the food they provide. And as for wild animals, most, though not all, can be used for food, or are useful in other ways. Clothing and instruments can be made out of them. If nature, then, makes nothing without some end in view, nothing to no purpose, it must be that nature has made all of them for the sake of man. This means that it is according to nature that even the art of war, since hunting is a part of it, should in a sense be a way of acquiring property, and that it must be used both against wild beasts and against such men as are by nature intended to be ruled over but refuse, for that is the kind of warfare which is by nature just. One form, then, of property-getting is, in accordance with nature, a part of household management, in that either the goods must be there to start with, or this technique of property-getting must see that they are provided. Goods, that is, which may be stored up as being necessary for providing a livelihood, or useful to household or state as associations. And it looks as if wealth in the true sense consists of property such as this. For the amount of property of this kind which would give self-sufficiency for a good life is not limitless, although Solon in one of his poems said, "No bound is set on riches for men, but there is a limit, as in the other skills, for none of them have any tools which are unlimited in size or number, and wealth is a collection of tools for use in the administration of a household or a state." It is clear, therefore, that there is a certain natural kind of property-getting practiced by those in charge of a household or a state, and why this is so is also clear. But there is another kind of property-getting, to which the term acquisition of goods is generally and justly applied, and it is due to this that there is thought to be no limit to wealth or property. Because it closely resembles that form of acquisition of goods which we have just been discussing, many suppose that the two are one and the same. But they are not the same, though admittedly they are not very different. One is natural, the other is not. This second kind develops from the exercise of a certain kind of skill won by some experience. Let us begin our discussion thus. Every piece of property has a double use. Both uses are uses of the thing itself, but they are not similar uses, for one is the proper use of the article in question, the other is not. For example, a shoe may be used either to put on your foot or to offer in exchange. Both are uses of the shoe, for even he that gives a shoe to someone who requires a shoe, and receives in exchange coins or food, is making use of the shoe as a shoe, but not the proper use of it, for a shoe is not expressly made for purposes of exchange. The same is the case with other pieces of property. The technique of exchange can be applied to all of them, and has its origin in a state of affairs often to be found in nature, namely, men having too much of this and not enough of that. It was essential that the exchange should be carried on far enough to satisfy the needs of the parties, so clearly trade is not a natural way of getting goods. The technique of exchange was obviously not a practice of the earliest form of association, the household. It only came in with the large forms. Members of a single household shared all the belongings of that house, but members of different households shared many of the belongings of other houses also. Mutual need of the different goods made it essential to contribute one's share, and it is on this basis that many of the non-Greek peoples still proceed, i.e., by exchange. They exchange one class of useful goods for another. For example, they take and give wine for corn and so on. But they do not carry the process any farther than this. Such a technique of exchange is not contrary to nature, and it is not a form of money-making, for it keeps to its original purpose, to re-establish nature's own equilibrium of self-sufficiency. All the same, it was out of it that money-making arose, predictably enough. For as soon as the import of necessities and the export of surplus goods began to facilitate the satisfaction of needs beyond national frontiers, men inevitably resorted to the use of coined money. Not all the things that we naturally need are easily carried, and so for purposes of exchange men entered into an agreement to give each other and accept from each other some commodity, itself useful for the business of living and also easily handled, such as iron, silver, and the like. The amounts were at first determined by size and weight, but eventually the pieces of metal were stamped. This did away with the necessity of measuring, since the stamp was put on as an indication of the amount. Once a currency was provided, development was rapid, and what started as a necessary exchange became trade, the other mode of acquiring goods. At first it was probably quite a simple affair, but then it became more systematic, as men become more experienced at discovering where and how the greatest profits might be made out of the exchanges. That is why the technique of acquiring goods is held to be concerned primarily with coin, and to have the function of enabling one to see where a great deal of money may be procured. The technique does after all produce wealth in the form of money, and wealth is often regarded as being a large quantity of coin, because coin is what the techniques of acquiring goods and of trading are concerned with. Sometimes, on the other hand, coinage is regarded as so much convention, and artificial trumpery having no root in nature, since, if those who employ a currency system choose to alter it, the coins cease to have their value and can no longer be used to procure the necessities of life. And it will often happen that a man with wealth in the form of coined money will not have enough to eat, and what a ridiculous kind of wealth is that which even in abundance will not save you from dying with hunger. It is like the story told of Midas. Because of the inordinate greed of his prey, everything that was set before him turned to gold. Hence men seek to define a different sense of wealth, and of the acquisition of goods, and are right to do so, for there is a difference. On the one hand, wealth and the acquisition of goods in accordance with nature and belonging to household management. On the other hand, the kind that is associated with trade, which is not productive of goods in the full sense, but only through their exchange. And it is thought to be concerned with coinage, because coinage both limits the exchange and is the unit of measurement by which it is performed. And there is indeed no limit to the amount of riches to be got from this mode of acquiring goods. The art of healing aims at producing unlimited health, and every other skill aims at its own end without limit, wishing to secure that to the highest possible degree. On the other hand, the means towards the end are not unlimited, the end itself setting the limit in each case. Similarly, there is no limit to the end which this kind of acquisition has in view, because the end is wealth in that form, i.e. the possession of goods. The kind which is household management, on the other hand, does have a limit, since it is not the function of household management to acquire goods. So, while it seems that there must be a limit to every form of wealth, in practice we find that the opposite occurs. All those engaged in acquiring goods go on increasing their coin without limit, because the two modes of acquisition of goods are so similar. For they overlap in that both are concerned with the same thing, property, but in their use of it they are dissimilar. In one case, the end is sheer increase, in the other, something different. Some people therefore imagine that increase is the function of the household management, and never cease to believe that their store of coined money ought either to be hoarded or increased without limit. The reason why some people get this notion into their heads may be that they are eager for life, but not for the good life. So, desire for life being unlimited, they desire also an unlimited amount of what enables it to go on. Others again, while aiming at the good life, seek what is conducive to the pleasure of the body. So, as this too appears to depend on the possession of property, their whole activity centres on business, and the second mode of acquiring goods owes its existence to this. For where enjoyment consists in excess, men look for that skill which produces the excess that is enjoyed. And if they cannot procure it through money-making, they try to get it by some other means, using all of their faculties for this purpose, which is contrary to nature. Courage, for example, is to produce confidence, not goods. Nor yet is it the job of military leadership and medicine to produce goods, but victory and health. But these people turn all skills into skills of acquiring goods, as though that were the end, and everything had to serve that end. We have now discussed the acquisition of goods, both the unnecessary kind of acquisition, what it is, and why we do in fact make use of it, and the necessary, which differs from the other in being concerned with household management, and food in a way that accords with nature, and also in being limited as opposed to unlimited. The answer also is clear to the question raised at the beginning, namely whether or not acquiring goods is the business of the household manager and statesman. The answer is perhaps that wealth should be at hand for his use from the start. Just as statesmanship has no need to make men, who are the material which nature provides and which statesmanship takes and uses, so nature can be expected to provide food, whether from land or sea or from some other source, and it is on this basis that the manager can perform his duty of distributing these supplies. So, weaving is not the art of producing wool, but of using it, though it is also the art of knowing good yarns from bad, and the suitable from the unsuitable. If, on the other hand, we do allow that acquiring goods is a part of management, why, it may well be asked, is not the art of medicine also a part? After all, the members of a household need to be healthy quite as much as to keep alive, or meet their daily needs. The answer, up to a point, is that it is the business of a manager or ruler to see to health, but only up to a point. Beyond that, it is the doctor's business. So, in the matters of goods, to some extent, these are the concern of the manager, but beyond that, they belong to the subsidiary skill. But best it is, as has been just said, that goods should be provided at the outset by nature. For it is a function of nature to provide food for whatever is brought to birth, since that from which it is born has a surplus which provides food in every case. We conclude, therefore, that the form of acquisition of goods that depends on crop and animal husbandry is for all men in accordance with nature. The acquisition of goods is, then, as we have said, of two kinds, one which is necessary and approved of, is to do with household management. The other, which is to do with trade and depends on exchange, is justly regarded with disapproval, since it arises not from nature, but from men's gaining from each other. Very much disliked also is the practice of charging interest, and the dislike is fully justified, for the gain arises out of currency itself, not as a product of that for which currency was provided. Currency was intended to be a means of exchange, whereas interest represents an increase in the currency itself, hence its name in Greek, tokos, meaning offspring. For each animal produces its like, and interest is currency born of currency. And so of all types of business, this is the most contrary to nature. Now that we have discussed adequately the theory, we ought to speak also about practice. In matters like this, theoretical speculation is free, but practical experience is tied fast to circumstances and needs. Some useful branches of the technique of acquiring wealth will now be mentioned. One may have experience in, first of all, stock rearing, in which one needs to know what kinds are the most profitable and where and how, for example, how to acquire horses, cattle, sheep, and other animals similarly. And further, one must know by experience which of these are the most profitable as compared with the rest, and which kinds in which areas, since some do better here, others there. The second, tillage, of fields sown with crops and fields planted for fruit. Third, beekeeping, and rearing such birds and fishes as can contribute to supplies. Those are the three main branches of the first and most appropriate way of acquiring wealth. The other method, that of exchange, the main branch is, first of all, commerce, subdivided into A. Shipping, B. Carrying goods, and C. Offering them for sale. In all these there are wide differences according to whether one looks for a high return or for security. Then 2. Money lending, and 3. Working for pay, whether A. as a skilled mechanic or B. as an unskilled worker useful only in manual labour. Somewhere between these two main categories of acquisition of goods we might put a third, since it has elements in it both of nature and of exchange. I refer to what is got out of the earth itself, or from uncultivated but useful things growing out of the earth, such occupations as timber working and mining of every description. This latter can be extensively subdivided, for the substances mined from the earth are of many types. About each of these methods I still have spoken only in a general way, and however useful a detailed account might be for those likely to be engaged in such occupations, it would be irksome to spend much time on them. Those occupations which require most skill are those in which there is the smallest element of chance. The most mechanical are those which cause the most deterioration to the bodies of the workers, the most slavish those in which most use is made of the body, and the most ignoble those in which there is least need to exercise virtue too. Moreover, people have written books on these topics. Caretides of Peiros and Apollodoros of Lemnos have manuals on agriculture, both crops and fruits, and others on other subjects, so that anyone who is interested may study them in those writers' works. It would be advisable to make a collection of all those scattered reports of methods by which men have succeeded in making money. It would certainly be very useful for those who think money-making important. For instance, Thales of Miletus used a money-spinning device which, though it was ascribed to his prowess as a philosopher, is in principle open to anybody. The story is as follows. People had been saying reproachfully to him that philosophy was useless, as it had left him a poor man. But he, deducing from his knowledge of the stars that there would be a good crop of olives, while it was still winter and he had little money to spare, used it to pay deposits on all the oil presses in Miletus and Chios, thus securing their hire. This cost him only a small sum, as there were no bidders. Then, the time of the olive harvest came, and as there was a sudden and simultaneous demand for oil presses, he hired them out at any price he liked to ask. He made a lot of money, and so demonstrated that it is easy for philosophers to become rich if they want to, but that is not their object in life. Such is the story of how Thales gave proof of his cleverness, but, as we have said, the principle can be applied generally. The way to make money is to get, if you can, a monopoly for yourself. Hence we find states also employing this method when they are short of money. They secure themselves a monopoly. There was a man in Sicily, too, who used a sum of money that had been deposited with him to buy up all the iron from the foundries. Then, when the merchants arrived from their shops, he used to be the only seller. And, without raising the price unduly, he turned his 50 talents into 150. When the ruler Dionysius heard of this, he told the man that he regarded such ways of raising money as detrimental to his own interests, and that he must therefore depart from Syracuse at once, though he might take his money with him. Thales' notion and this man's are the same. Both managed to create a monopoly for themselves. All this knowledge is useful for statesmen too, for many states are in greater need of business and the income it brings than a household is. Hence we find that some of those who direct the affairs of a state actually make this their sole concern. There are, as we saw, 3 parts of household management, one being the rule of a master, which has already been dealt with, the next the rule of a father, and a third which arises out of the marriage relationship. This is included because rule is exercised over wife and children, over both of them as free persons, but in other respects differently. Over a wife, rule is as by a statesman, over children, as by a king. For the male is more fitted to rule than the female, unless conditions are quite contrary to nature, and the elder and fully grown is more fitted than the younger and underdeveloped. It is true that in most cases of rule by statesmen there is an interchange of the role of ruler and ruled, which aims to preserve natural equality and non-differentiation. Nevertheless, so long as one is ruling and the other is being ruled, the ruler seeks to mark distinctions in outward dignity, in style of address and in honours paid. Witness what Amasis said about his foot basin. As between male and female, this kind of relationship is permanent. Rule over children is royal, for the begetter is ruler by virtue of both affection and of age, and this type of rule is royal. Homer, therefore, was right in calling Zeus father of gods and men, as he was king over them all. For a king ought to have a natural superiority, but to be no different in birth, and this is just the condition of elder in relation to younger, and of father to son. It is clear, then, that in household management the people are of greater importance than the inanimate property, and their virtue of more account than that of the property which we call their wealth, and also that the free men are of more account than slaves. About slaves, the first question to be asked is whether in addition to their virtue as tools and servants, they have another and more valuable one. Can they possess restraint, courage, justice, and every other condition of that kind? Or have they in fact nothing but the serviceable quality of their persons? The question may be answered in either of 2 ways, but both present a difficulty. If we say that slaves have these virtues, how then will they differ from free men? If we say that they have not, the position is anomalous, since they are human beings and share in reason. Roughly the same question can also be put in relation to wife and child. Have not these also virtues? Ought a woman to be restrained, brave, and just? And is a child sometimes intemperate, sometimes restrained, or not? All these questions might be regarded as part of our wider inquiry into the natural ruler and ruled, and in particular whether or not the virtue of the one is the same as the virtue of the other. For if the highest excellence is required of both, why should one rule unqualifiedly, and the other unqualifiedly obey? A distinction of more or less will not do here. The difference between ruling and obeying is one of kind, and quantitative difference is simply not that at all. If, on the other hand, the one is to have virtues, and the other not, we have a surprising state of affairs. For if he that rules is not to be restrained and just, how shall he rule well? And if the ruled lacks these virtues, how shall he be ruled well? If he is intemperate and feckless, he'll perform none of his duties. Thus it becomes clear that both ruler and ruled must have a share in virtue, but there are differences in virtue in each case, as there are also among those who by nature rule. An immediate indication of this is afforded by the soul, where we find natural ruler and natural subject, whose virtues we regard as different, one being that of the rational element, the other of the non-rational. It is therefore clear that the same feature will be found in the other cases too, so that most instances of ruling and being ruled are natural. For a rule of free over slave, male over female, man over boy, are all different, because while parts of the soul are present in each case, the distribution is different. Thus, the deliberative faculty in the soul is not present at all in a slave. In a female, it is present but ineffective. In a child, present but underdeveloped. We should therefore take it that the same conditions inevitably prevail in regard to the moral virtues also, namely that all must participate in them, but not all in the same way, but only as may be required by each for his proper function. The ruler, then, must have moral virtue in its entirety, for his function is, in its fullest sense, that of a master craftsman, and reason is a master craftsman. And the other members must have such amount as is appropriate to each. So it is evident that each of the classes spoken of must have moral virtue, and that restraint is not the same in a man as in a woman, nor justice or courage either. As Socrates thought, the one is the courage of the ruler, the other the courage of a servant, and likewise with other virtues. If we look at the matter case by case, it will become clearer. For those who talk in generalities and say that virtue is a good condition of the soul, or that it is right conduct, or the like, delude themselves. Better than those who look for definitions in that matter are those who, like Gorgias, enumerate the different virtues. For instance, the poet singles out silence as bringing credit to a woman, but that is not so for a man. This is the method of assessment that we should always follow. Take the child. He is not yet fully developed, so we cannot speak of his virtue as belonging to him in relation to himself. It exists only in relation to the progress of his development towards adulthood, and to whoever is his guide. So too with slave and master. We laid it down that a slave is useful for necessary tasks, so the amount of virtue required will not be very great, but only enough to ensure that he does not neglect his work through intemperance or fecklessness. If this is true, one will naturally ask whether skilled workers too will not need virtue to keep them from the intemperance which often interferes with their work. But the parallel is far from exact, because the slave shares his master's life, whereas the craftsman lives away from his employer and participates in virtue in the same measure as he participates in slavery, while the skilled mechanic is in a restricted sense in a condition of slavery. There is also this difference, that the slave is one of a group that are slaves by nature, which cannot be said of a shoemaker or other skilled worker. It is clear, therefore, that it is the master who ought to be the cause of such virtue in his slave, not the man who instructs the slave in his tasks. Hence, they are wrong who would deny all reason to slaves and say that a master has nothing to do but issue orders. Suggestion and advice are even more appropriately given to slaves than to children. So much then for our discussion of these matters. As for man and wife, children and father, and the virtue that appertains to each and their intercourse with one another, what is right in that connection and what is not, and the proper pursuit of the good therein and the avoidance of the bad, all such matters it will be necessary to discuss in connection with the constitutions. For these relationships are part of the household, and every household is part of a state, and the virtue of the part ought to be examined in relation to the virtue of the whole. This means that both children and women must be educated with an eye to the constitution, at least if it is true that it makes a difference to the soundness of a state that its children should be sound, and its women too. And it must make a difference, for women make up half the adult-free population, and from children come those who will participate in the constitution. So, now that we have finished with these matters and decided to discuss the rest in another place, we will regard the present topic as concluded, and make a fresh beginning. And let our first topic be those who have pronounced an opinion on the best constitution. And that is the end of Aristotle's The Politics, Book 1. I hope you've enjoyed listening to it as much as I've enjoyed reading it, as I find that Aristotle's work's an absolute delight to read. Please like, share and subscribe, tell your friends, spread the word and all that good stuff. We're trying to grow the channel as much as we can, so any word of mouth that helps us grow organically is very much appreciated. Aristogenesis is already in the works, and we will be dealing with a few foundational parts of Indo-European religion, from the Sky Father to the Sacred Flame. This has been another Aristogenesis reading. Thank you very much for listening. Until next time.